Dear Professor Appiah, dear colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome Kwame Anthony Appiah as this year's Hans Blumenberg Professor. It is a great honor, dear Professor Appiah, that you've accepted our invitation and come to the Cluster of Excellence, Religion and Politics at the University of Münster. Thank you very much for being here. The Hans Blumenberg Professorship was established in 2016 with the aim of bringing international scholars to Münster who conduct cutting-edge research on the relationship between religion and politics. After Sarah Strumsa from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who spoke to us about philosophical traditions in the Islamic world and scholarly traditions in their study, and Maribel Fierro from the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas in Madrid, who delivered a presentation on the politics of Al-Andalus, we now have, for the first time, a Blumenberg professor working on contemporary philosophy and in a unique way. Kwame Anthony Appiah was born in London. He studied philosophy and obtained his doctorate at the University of Cambridge. He then moved to Yale, where he was first an assistant professor, then an associate professor of philosophy, African and Afro-American studies. From Yale, he moved to Cornell University as a full professor, from Cornell to Duke University, and from Duke to Harvard University, where he was the Charles H. Carswell Professor of Afro-American Studies and of Philosophy. In 2002, Kwame Anthony Appiah moved to Princeton, where he became the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Philosophy and Human Values, including several affiliations with other departments, centers, and programs, such as Afro-American Studies, African Studies, Comparative Literature, Politics, Translation and Intercultural Communication, and Gender and Sexuality Studies. Since 2014, Kwame Anthony Appiah has been Professor of Philosophy and Law at New York University. He is also a member of several prestigious academies and institutions, including the American Academy of Arts and Letters, of which he is president, the American Philosophical Society, and the Royal Society of Literature. Kwame Anthony Appiah has received numerous honors and awards, including several honorary doctorates, such as Doctors of Letters, honoris causa, from Columbia University, the New School, the University of Pennsylvania, or the University of Cambridge, to name but a few, or Doctors of Laws, honoris causa, from Harvard University, the University of Edinburgh, and many more. This very brief summary gives you a first impression of the grandeur of this year's Blumenberg Professor. The outstanding reception of his work in the wider public and among scholars shows that researchers from a wide range of disciplines see what Kwame Anthony Appiah does as an extraordinarily valuable contribution to their field, be it philosophy, African studies, law, sociology, religious studies, politics, social anthropology, theology, or literature. Since our Cluster of Excellence is made up of 25 different disciplines, we always have to balance the interests of all of these disciplines when we decide who the Blumenberg Professor will be. Not only in this sense, dear Professor Appiah, you are the ideal Blumenberg Professor because colleagues from more than a dozen different disciplines recognized you immediately as one of them. Why is that? It seems to me that what you write is both difficult and easy in the best sense of the word. It is difficult because you deal with complex issues such as belonging, identity, or cosmopolitanism. But you break these big concepts down into small parts, representing aspects of the subject, and you work them out very carefully, using your broad knowledge so that you can give a multi-perspective and yet easily understandable treatment to questions that are otherwise difficult to make sense of. Your first two books, published 30 years ago, have rather technical titles: Assertion and Conditionals, and A Plea for Truth in Semantics. You began your career as an analytic philosopher of language, trained to distinguish what might seem fuzzy and to remain precise where imprecision seems an attractive way of avoiding the difficult questions. You don't avoid these difficult questions. You address them gently, acutely, and entertainingly. So we are very much looking forward to what you have to say about ways of belonging, religion as creed, as practice, and as identity. Thank you very much for being here and speaking to us.
That was a very generous introduction. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So that'll be my fun. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, or a Roman Catholic. But I have feasted at Eid al-Fitr with my Muslim cousins, celebrated Seders at home with my in-laws, recited a Sanskrit mantra as I meditated alone, and attended a nuptial mass conducted by a cardinal. Through much of my childhood, I sang in an Anglican school choir in England and went to Sunday school during the vacations at an interdenominational church in Ghana. And like my Ghanaian Methodist father, I have poured libations to our ancestors, who were once as real to me as the God whose presence I felt when I prayed. We offered schnapps to our ancestors. That's a Ghanaian custom, ever since there's been schnapps imported. We offered schnapps to our ancestor, the great Asante, 18th century Asante general. His name was Akramampim, so we would say, Akramampim bejin sannum. Our ancestor Akramampim, take this to drink, take this alcohol to drink. As a child, I gained security from an old gold crucifix that hung on a chain around my neck, which had been blessed by a spirit that spoke through the mediumship of a Scottish postman, who also reassured me by transmitting benevolent messages from my long-dead English grandfather. So I was in touch with my British ancestors as much as well. And the magic in my life was as bicultural as my ancestry. Like millions of people, I have experienced the inward peace that comes from transcendental meditation, the sense of oneness with everything that is spoken of in contemplative traditions from around the world. And once, at the end of a long season of training, rowing swiftly along the Thames, I experienced what seemed to me like the same sense of communion with the universe. There, as in the daily meditations of my teenage years, I felt with the blessed Julian of Norwich, who lived 6 centuries ago, that all will be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Throughout recorded history, people around the world have believed in invisible spirits, sought mystical experiences, gathered in communal rituals at buildings dedicated to the purpose, studied scriptures, lived daily lives shaped by things unseen, and had hopes and fears for a life beyond this one. It is natural, I think, to say that the prayers, the rituals, the ceremonies, the beliefs, and the experiences I have been discussing deserve to be called religious. They are an enormous assortment of elements, however. So it's not at all surprising that people make a very wide range of appeals to religion in explaining human behavior. But what does it mean to assign to religion the power to explain anything? After all, as I've just tried to show you, remind you, almost any feature of everyday life is or can be connected in a variety of ways with something we might call religion. The institutions, beliefs, and practices we call religious are so diverse that it sometimes seems there is little point in giving them that one label. Religions are sources of identity and bearers of creed. They are associated with practices of everyday life, including performances of gender, and they can bring belief and affect together in powerful ways. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz recognized in the religions he studied, which ranged from Morocco to Bali, a capacity to create what he called long-lasting moods and motivations through their pictures of reality, uniting fact and feeling in powerful ways. But in the contemporary world, claims about reality are especially important signals of a class of identities, as evangelical Christians in the United States, as Hindus in India, as Jews in Israel, as Christians and Muslims in Ghana, that have become central to politics. Those labels are now associated in these very different democracies with views about the nature and the role of the state. People typically express and assert these identities, in part through creedal claims or through commitment to practices, such as taking Holy Communion, or celebrating the Sabbath at a Friday dinner, or abstaining from meat in general, or from pork in particular. Americans and conservatives are more likely to say what in English is called grace, Tischgebet, before meals. I wanted to start by reminding you of that diversity, and now I want to sketch three elements that show up to varying degrees in different religious traditions, and I want to argue that disaggregating these elements can help us sometimes to understand some of the very many ways in which religion can generate conflict in societies that are now inevitably multi-religious. But also, I think this disaggregation can offer us guides to thinking about the attitudes that will allow us to resolve some of these conflicts. Part of the diversity of religion flows, I think, from the differences in the relative role of these three dimensions, in particular of religions, creed, practice, and identity. And I'm going to start, as a good Protestant, with creed. The weekly religious services of most Christians around the world include a shared enunciation of belief. Assyrian, Anglican, Coptic, Eastern Syriac, Greek Orthodox, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Russian Orthodox, and hundreds of Protestant churches, there are of course thousands of Protestant churches, pronounce a creed, usually based on the one adopted at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 and amended in Constantinople in 381, the thing that's now usually called the Nicene Creed. There are exceptions. The Unitarian Universalists, for example, in the United States, who draw on Christian traditions among others, often describe themselves as creedless. And the Mormon Church has a sort of creed of its own, articulating the 13 beliefs that Joseph Smith, their founder, took to be central to his faith, though each of those 13 propositions does begin with, "We believe." Still, but they differ a good deal from what's in the Nicene Creed on many matters. Still, much of the development of Christian divisions between Roman Catholics and the Oriental Orthodox churches, say, or in Western Europe between Roman Catholics and a growing number of Protestant sects after the Reformation, include disagreements about claims made in these creeds. Some divisions between Miaphysites, who hold that Christ had one nature that was both fully human and fully divine, and the Chalcedonian view that Christ has two natures in one person, these are matters of Christological doctrine and concern beliefs that require extremely sophisticated philosophical concepts just to understand what's supposed to be at stake. It seems extremely unlikely, therefore, that most of the members of the churches that had these disputes, who would have been many of them pre-literate and philosophically untrained, could have given an account of what the debates were actually about. Even university-educated Christians today, at least in my country, are unlikely to have a grasp of the doctrines of nature and of substance that underlie such disagreements. So the utterance of the creed looks for them much less like the enunciation of propositions actually believed than a practice that signals membership in an institution and reflects an identity. The creeds were developed, of course, by bishops who knew the Christian Bible with its union of Hebrew and Aramaic texts and the Koine texts of the New Testament extremely well. They thought that these texts were divinely inspired and contained truth. And excerpts from both the Old and the New Testaments are still read and interpreted at Christian services as often as the creed in all those traditions I mentioned. Therefore, it's natural, I think, that many Christians think of having the sort of beliefs expressed in the creeds and taking the scriptures seriously as central to their commitments as Christians. And it's equally natural for outsiders observing these Christian practices to suppose that claims made in the scriptures must be accepted by all or most Christians. For Jews and Muslims too, scriptures are central to communal religious services and to individual lives. Learning the Quran by heart and studying the Torah are highly regarded practices in their respective traditions. And a well-known hadith tells us that the Prophet said, "The best among you are those who learn the Quran and teach it." So many people today, including many people who claim religious identities, think of scriptures as fixing what a religion requires of its adherents, adopting a kind of scriptural determinism that claims that religious people must be bound by what is in the texts they revere. And so they go to those texts to find, instead of asking them, they go to the text to find out what they're supposed to believe. Christians and Muslims in Ghana, for example, seem largely convinced that they must condemn homosexuality because the scriptures do. So this is scriptural determinism, as it were, applied to yourself. These arguments assume, as I said, this scriptural determinism. If this is our scripture, we must believe this. If this is your scripture, you must believe this and act as it says. Nevertheless, many contemporary people in the North Atlantic world who claim Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or Hindu identity don't know very much about any scriptural tradition. I'm not talking about the people who profess to be atheists. I'm talking about the people who profess to belong to these traditions. Once male Jews would have studied the Torah regularly. Nowadays, many people who identify as Jews don't really study even the proportion of the Torah that you interpret when you are called to the Torah as a bar or a bat mitzvah. One of my favorite games in New York is asking Jewish friends if they remember their Torah portion, the portion of the Torah that they had to explicate. And the answer usually is no. American Hindus, like many Hindus in South Asia, aren't very likely to know Sanskrit or to be able to tell you more than a few of the thousands and thousands of tales in the rich body of ancient Hindu religious writings. Devout Muslims may study the Quran, but most are not schooled in interpreting the transcribed oral traditions, the hadith, like the one I just mentioned, that report the doings and sayings of the Prophet and his companions and define the Sunnah, the example given by the life of the Prophet and his companions. So it may be worth pointing out some of the features that are common to these scriptural writings, since the determinist argument requires us to evaluate claims about the interpretation of Scripture. So first, much scriptural language is, as we all know, poetical. It invites us to read it as metaphor, and figurative language always requires active interpretation. The Lord is my shepherd. That does not mean I am a sheep. The practical guidance of scriptures is also often very abstract. Most Europeans believe that Muslim men may have up to 4 wives. Well, what the Surah An-Nisa says is this: if you fear you cannot act fairly towards the orphans, then marry the women you like, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be fair, then 1, or what you already have. That makes it more likely that you avoid bias. The context is a set of issues about the treatment of female orphans, which means that it's sort of complicated figuring out what's going on there. But addressed to a community in which men could marry more than 4 wives, which was the condition of pre-Islamic Arabia, this can seem like an invitation to marry 4 or less. But given human nature and the challenges of fairness, this might as naturally be seen as an encouragement to have only one wife. After all, only a fool would be confident that he could be fair to four. And because scriptures are often seen as a whole in some sense, serious readers see each passage in the light of all the others. They engage in a kind of holistic interpretation, seeking a coherent account that makes the best sense of all the parts. So let me give just one Christian example. Nothing is clearer, I think, than that the book of Leviticus permits the perpetual enslavement of Gentiles, even while it insists that Jews whose labor has been bought, who are not really slaves, must be released from obligation in the year of Jubilee that occurs every 50 years. St. Paul in the New Testament tells slaves that they should obey their masters with fear and trembling. This is the phrase he uses in other contexts. With fear and trembling as unto Christ. In between, the Bible mentions slavery hundreds of times, sometimes imposing limits on how slaves should be treated, usually to the advantage of the slaves, but nowhere rejecting slavery as such. It is not any particular text, but the whole body of description of the discussion of scriptural slavery as a whole that is likely to seem important to any scripture-reading Christian. So surely Christians are bound to accept slavery then. Well, the campaigns against the British slave trade in Africa were led by Quakers, serious committed Christians, and no mainstream Christian denomination accepts slavery today. Pope Paul III, already in 1537, long before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, forbade the enslavement of Indians in the Americas. In the relevant encyclical, he said, "Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means deprived of their liberty or of the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, nor should they be in any way enslaved." That's pretty clear language. A Martian, reading the Christian scriptures, would believe the opposite, no doubt. Scriptures survive in part precisely because they aren't lists of beliefs or instructions on how to live. And the point here is that the passages that explicitly maintain slavery, or mention it, are going to be read in the light of other passages that treat of how people in general are to be treated, whatever their status. As Pope Gregory XVI put it in condemning slavery in 1839, "But as the law of the gospel universally and earnestly enjoyed a sincere charity towards all, and considering our Lord Jesus Christ had declared that he considered as done or refused to himself every kind and merciful deed done or refused to the small and needy, it naturally follows that Christians should regard as their brothers their slaves." So the point is that the story of sacred texts has always been the story of their readers and of shifting and clashing interpretations. We can understand why insiders sometimes want to deny this. They want theirs to be the whole everlasting truth. But objective observers from outside can see that religion, like everything else that is important in human life, evolves. And some observers within these traditions celebrate these developments as a sign of a deepening understanding of their faith. To the extent that the development occurs in dialogue with other religious traditions among which they live, it's possible, as collaboration and comity develop, to move towards interpretations that fit with those others. This is something that has happened with the Abrahamic traditions in the United States. Despite the liturgical differences, much of what you will see in some synagogues in Manhattan seems very like what is going on in some Protestant churches nearby. Organs, stained glass windows, pews, Bibles in front of you, prayer books, references to God under names familiar to Christians, and so on. Nevertheless, we can see why readings of scriptural traditions taken seriously at a particular place and time can generate conflict. Christians have often thought that a kind of belief, the kind called faith in English, can be a morally worthy achievement, even a source of justification so important that it may be rewarded with eternal life. And if faith is virtuous, infidelity will be a vice. So while the penalties imposed on unbelief by the Holy Inquisition, for example, included many forms of penance, thousands of people were in fact burned to death in Europe and the Americas between the beginnings of that institution in France in the 12th century through to its eventual abolition at the beginning of the 19th century. Likewise, apostasy, turning away from Islam or from Islamic orthodoxy, is a capital offense in traditional Sharia. And while diverting from practices like abstaining from pork or speaking blasphemy or mistreating the Quran can be a sign of apostasy, apostasy is, at its heart, a matter of unbelief. Nevertheless, there aren't a lot of contemporary executions for apostasy, though there are significant murders or extrajudicial killings of people who are regarded as apostates by their neighbors in a few Muslim societies today, but formal execution for apostasy is very, very rare. This focus on mistaken belief as not an error but a vice, not so much an epistemic as a moral matter, is very much internal to particular traditional religions. There is no similar concern for purity of creed in many places outside the Abrahamic traditions. The first commandment, acknowledged by Jews and Christians and Muslims, is, "You shall have no other gods before me." But for many polytheistic traditions, from Hinduism to the traditional religion of Ashanti, where I grew up, there's no sense that anyone should focus their worship or their faith on a particular divinity or worry too much about details of doctrine. In 19th century Ashanti, I doubt anyone would have claimed to know the whole truth about the gods or the ancestors or any other spiritual beings, nor would they have worried much about what anyone else believed or devoted a lot of energy to forming a precise picture of spiritual matters. The Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe once said to me, "I don't think my ancestors would have bothered to go 3,000 miles to tell somebody they were wrong about religion." As for proper worship, they would have cared only if mistaken practices by their family and neighbors brought the wrath of the spirits down on their community, which they might have feared. But much of the religious material I mentioned at the start is about doing things, not about believing anything. A Jewish Seder is a ceremony which is engaged in today by tens of thousands, millions of people who have almost no creedal commitments or very diverse creedal commitments among them, including atheism. The Catholic marriage service, the nuptial mass I mentioned, was attended by friends of the bride and groom who were undoubtedly not Roman Catholics, so much so that the presiding Cardinal Archbishop began his homily by saying, "As many of you may not know, I'm not married myself," implying that he had an audience that might include people unaware of the celibacy of the Catholic priesthood. And minor variations in practice can enable you to recognize others as members of your particular denomination or forms of worship, or as interlopers from another. Consider what Muslims do with their forefinger during prayer. When you utter the tashahhud, you offer praise to God and peace to the Prophet, and you bear witness that there is no God but Allah. Sunnis tend to lift their finger during this part of the prayer, and Sunni clerics class raising your fingers in this context as one of the things that are recommended, not compulsory. So it's not required, but it's commended. The general thought is that the pointing indicates the greatness of the one you are addressing. Yet how and when people point differs from one school to another, one school of Islamic jurisprudence to another, and even from one congregation to another. Differences of practice like these are not, of course, anything like uniquely Muslim. I looked up on WikiHow instructions on how you're supposed to make the sign of the cross, and the answer is, well, it depends on which church you go to. But it would take more than a website to discover when you should cross yourself, according to the various traditions that permit or require it. And Protestants, other than Anglicans, Methodists, and Lutherans, tend not to do it at all. In fact, in the 17th century, it would have been regarded as a sign that you were a papist if you cross yourself. So much religious ritual practice floats free of specific beliefs and signifies identities, but that doesn't mean it cannot lead to conflict. After all, identities lead to conflict all the time. Within communities, there is often the kind of fierce debate about practice that there is about these questions about raising the finger among Sunnis. But across communities, differences in practices seem to me to be significant, largely as signs of different identities. It's not conflicts over practice so much as conflicts between groups of different identities. And I'll discuss an example of this in a moment at the end. However, the most obvious places where practical disagreements can lead to conflict between groups of different religious identities is, of course, where ethical ideas, ideas about universal principles of behavior or about universal values, are associated with particular religious identities. To the extent that an ethical claim is founded in a metaphysical belief that is not shared across religious identities, there will be no basis in shared beliefs to appeal to in seeking to settle disagreements. To the extent, for example, that a belief about the wrongness of abortion is grounded in an idea that an embryo has a soul from the moment of conception, there are not likely to be ways of coming to agreement with those who do not believe in souls or about how embryos or fetuses should be treated. Similarly, a general ethical commitment to the welfare of animals, whether or not it is grounded in religious identity, can come into conflict with religious ideas about how animals ought to be treated. The general respect for cattle, and cows in particular, in Hinduism, or the objection to animal killing for human use of many ethical vegans, can come into conflict with the idea of kosher or halal foods, or the practice of animal sacrifice in many African traditions and in Haitian voodoo, since these last presuppose that certain forms of animal treatment are a matter of religious obligation. It's not just that you're free to do them, you're required to do them. And I'll say something about this sort of issue again towards the end. So I've been speaking so far about beliefs and practices and about how complicated the story is about those. Let me turn now more explicitly to a discussion of identity. There are, of course, many large identities that are important, gender, nationality, class, culture, race, and so on. Why do they matter, and what do they have in common? I think in thinking about religious identities, it helps to begin with the things that these very disparate forms of grouping people have in common. So I think it's helpful to start with identities in general before focusing out about what is specific to religious identities. And the first general point about identities is, in my view, under-recognized, and it is this: identities require labels. And understanding an identity requires that you know how to apply labels, to apply some sign or marker of identity. And this, from the philosophers in the room, naturally leads to nominalism about identities rather than realism about them. Then you can look for someone of that identity once you have the way the marks are mobilized and see whether the label applies. Now, it's a very important fact that people disagree generally about the boundaries here. Mustafa Topal, a Dane of Kurdish ancestry, wrote a piece in Dagbladet Information a while back, which was headed Danskheid has become a national religion that one cannot convert to. So Danishness is a national religion, you can't convert to it. So there's apparently a dispute in Denmark about whether a person of Kurdish origins can really be called a Dane, can really fit the Danish label. But of course these labels only work because there's consensus about a lot of central cases. You'll be glad to know that the Danish royal family are regarded as Danish by everybody, except when they marry someone not Danish. A second point is that membership in an identity group helps shape the members' emotions and their deeds. It creates what I've called norms of identification, which are ideas about how you should behave given your identity. Sometimes people say to themselves, I'm doing this because I'm a Catholic, or because I'm black, or because I'm an American or a German. So a German might say, I'm avoiding nationalism because I'm a German. And one of the commonest ways in which identity matters is that we feel some sort of solidarity with people who are other bearers of the same mark, other bearers of the label. So our common identity gives us reasons, we think, to care about and to help one another. But just as there's usually conflict about the boundaries of the group, about who's in and who's out, about who can be Danish, there's almost always disagreement about what normative significance an identity has. What does being German mean? Well, as you know, better than I do, Germans don't agree about that. But the Danes don't agree about what it means to be Danish, Americans don't agree about what it means to be American, Methodists don't agree about what it means to be Methodist, and so on. Men don't agree about what it means to be men. So there's a third feature identities share. Identities don't just give you reasons to do things, they don't form the basis of norms of identification only. They also, for better and worse, give other people reasons to do things to you. And among the most significant things people do with identities is use them as the basis of hierarchies of status and respect and of structures of power. In many places in the world, one ethnic or religious group regards its members as superior to others and assumes the right to better treatment, including better treatment by the state. So, to summarize all this in a few sentences, identities come with labels and ideas about why and to whom they should be applied. Your identity shapes your thoughts about how you should behave, and it affects the way other people treat you. And all these elements of identity are contestable, up for dispute, who's in, what they're like, how they should behave, how they should be treated. Now, all of these things are emphatically true of religious identities today. Yes, there are labels, Roman Catholic, Sunni, and there are disputes about how to apply them. Who's a real Catholic? Are those guys who are still stuck with thinking about liberation theology, are they really Catholics? Yes, for most people who claim a religious identity, they think that that commits them to certain courses of action, communion, Eucharist, whatever, or to certain beliefs. But again, there's a great deal of disagreement about what actions and beliefs are associated by the people who have the label with their having the label. The Anglican Church, in which I grew up, is divided now between those who believe their faith requires them to accept LGBT people, gay people, and those who believe it requires their condemnation. Some Ahmadiyya Muslims, who are not regarded as Muslim at all by some Sunni and Shia authorities, believe that there is no earthly punishment for apostasy. They don't share that thing that I said was part of Sharia tradition. And yes, how people of one religious identity treat each other and treat people of other religions is enormously various, as are ideas about how people of various religions should be treated, whether they're your religion or somebody else's. Religious identities, like others, shape solidarities. People align themselves with those whose identities they share, though they fight very closely with those whose identity they share when they have slight disagreements with them. Then that's what Freud called the narcissism of minor differences. They will be able, but normally you'll be able to call on people to assist you on the basis of being, say, fellow Methodists. And your ethical commitments may be associated in your mind with a religious identity and tradition, even though they are perfectly general normative commitments that could be and are in fact shared by people of many other religious identities. That's why a significant percentage of Americans are worried that if you're not religious, you can't be moral. They think they associate morality with their particular religious traditions. They understand that other religious traditions have morality. The idea of free-floating moral commitments strikes them as strange. But of course, that an ethical precept is associated in the minds of its followers with a religious identity is no reason to doubt that it can be followed by people of other religious identities, or of course by people who don't have any religious identity. All right, so I've distinguished between belief, practice, and identity, but in obvious ways, as I've also been trying to suggest, that of course these all interpenetrate each other. The declaration of belief, as I said, is sometimes a form of practice. What matters is saying credo in unum Deum, not figuring out what it really means. And of course, communities define themselves by and through both beliefs and practices. So identities, beliefs, and practices are connected because beliefs and practices come with identities. That's because of the norms of identification. That's one reason that differences in belief define sects, even if they don't always create them. in any straightforward way. Protestantism began with dissatisfaction about the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, but ended with differences in doctrine and in practice. And that too is how my father's Methodists broke off from the Anglican Church. John Wesley, one of the two brothers who founded Methodism, he said, when the Methodists leave the Church of England, God will leave the Methodists, but the Methodists left anyway. When we find conflicts that seem to be on the basis of religion, I started by asking, what does religion explain? It can be worth trying to figure out whether what is at their heart is conflicts over creeds, over practices, or over identities. So I want to end with a necessarily oversimplified example. There's no doubt that many of the Sanskritic traditions of South Asia show a particular reverence for cows, as well as a more general tendency towards avoiding the consumption of animal flesh. Not all Hindus are vegetarian or vegan, of course, but many were and are. In Jain traditions, the reverence for animal life extends to insects. It's one of the reasons some Jains wear masks, so they don't accidentally inhale an insect. And the avoidance of harm to all animals, including, of course, humans, is a vital part of Jain practice. But the ideal of ahimsa, avoiding violence to all creatures, is central to Hinduism and to Buddhism. So, as a matter of creed, for Hindus, cows are sacred, and non-violence to all creatures is commended. That's there all over those texts. And yet, the Bhagavad Gita is a Sanskrit scripture in which the god Krishna advises Arjuna, a warrior prince, that it is his dharma, his ethical duty, to participate in the war with his cousins, about which Arjun has serious doubts. So because this text presupposes that war can be just, it cannot be said to be committed to non-violence. Still, the veneration for cattle, and especially for milk cows, which symbolize motherhood, generosity, and non-violence, is present in both ancient Sanskrit texts, like the Mahabharata, and in Hindu practice, and their slaughter has been widely condemned among Hindus in modern times as well, starting in the 19th century under the British Raj. There were movements to protect cattle. Indeed, the fact that Muslims kill and eat cows was one of the focuses of anti-Muslim sentiment in communal riots starting in the 19th century in South Asia, and was a crucial element of the communal violence that led to the partition of India from Pakistan. The association of cows with various divinities, with motherhood, and with Hinduism itself means that for many Hindus, the avoidance of harm to cows is one of those long-lasting moods and motivations that Geert spoke of. Hinduism conceives of reality in a way that makes the practices and norms associated with particular strands of Hindu tradition appear especially fitting, or as Geertz put it, uniquely realistic. So beliefs, practices, and identity all cohere to make the issue especially salient in the lives of those for whom Hindu is a modern religious identity. Insofar as scriptures go, Hinduism has a very large pool on which to draw. The two largest Sanskrit epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, contain some 2.25 million words. There are also the four Vedas and the Upanishads, composed over more than a millennium, beginning in the second millennium BCE. They are enormously diverse in their language, form, and content. And it's not surprising that out of these sources and hundreds of commentaries on them, it's possible to draw a very wide range of views on many topics. Still, hardly anyone denies that Hinduism came early to respect the cow, or that the respect is associated with most Hindus today, by most Hindus today, with their Hindu identity. For the Muslims of South Asia, on the other hand, beef eating is a normal practice, provided the animal has been properly slaughtered, as is the tanning of cowhides and the wearing of leather goods. As usual with religious identities, there are exceptions. Some Sufi are vegetarians. The handling, and not everybody agrees that Sufis are Muslims, but, they think they're Muslims. The handling of dead cattle in their hides is one of the many practices regarded as unclean by most Hindus, and so it's consigned, along with other supposedly unclean practices, to the Dalits, who were once called untouchables. As a result, the workers in India's leather industry are largely Muslim or Dalit. The Indian Council for Leather Exports, I looked at their website, says that the export of footwear, leather and leather products from India was to the tune of $5.26 billion in 2022-23. And in 2022, India exported $2.2 billion worth of beef. So on the one hand, the majority of Indians revere cattle, and on the other hand, India is home to an industry that exports billions of dollars worth of goods made from dead cattle, even though the BJP, the party in power and recently re-elected to power, attempted to ban the sale of cattle for slaughter in 2017 in a decision that was reversed by the Indian Supreme Court, which said they couldn't do that. Against this background, attacks on people suspected to be involved in the slaughter of cattle are largely going to be attacks by Hindus on Muslims and Dalits. And since both of these groups are regarded with hostility by many of India's Hindus, it will be hard to distinguish these attacks from casteism or Islamophobia, and hard to think of them as other than religiously motivated. This is all the more obvious given that while the cow is of enormous symbolic significance in India, as I just said, there's a good deal of evidence that many ordinary Hindus don't actually have a deep concern for the welfare of particular cows. I looked up a study of 28 farms with 571 cows in Kerala, published in 2020, which showed that almost all of them were treated in ways that violate contemporary norms of animal welfare, not just on European farms, which have higher standards than American farms, but even on American farms. There is, now that's 571 cattle in a country which has 60 million dairy cattle, but so far as I can see, there's no reason to doubt that this was representative, and the practices described, putting rings through their noses and pulling them around, so all of that is entirely routine in South Asia. So, there's no doubt that discussion of the welfare of cattle in India is strongly affected by the association of cattle slaughter with Dalits and Muslims, groups defined as having religious identities. I mean, Dalits are defined by a religious identity that has to do with their place outside the Indian caste system. The recent attacks on Muslims associated with so-called cattle protection are clearly, at least in part, reflections of Islamophobia, that is of hostility to Muslims qua Muslims. But the concern for the welfare of cattle among Hindus is not something that was invented in order to provide a basis for persecuting Muslims, and there's equally no doubt that much of that concern is genuine. Nor, finally, should we overstate the scale of this violence, as coverage in the West tends to, even if communal violence affects more than the people who are actually killed by it, because I can't find evidence of more than 50 such deaths in India over the last 10 to 15 years. So it's not like it's happening every day. So I've been arguing that it helps to distinguish matters of creed and practice and identity. In pursuing this issue, there's an important creedal distinction between a concern for animal welfare and a prohibition on causing the death of animals. Hindus generally believe in the idea of karma and that souls are born and reborn in all living things. They also tend to think that each creature's life has a natural end. As a result, killing an animal is an interference in the religiously prescribed natural order, and it affects a soul that may one day be embodied in a human being and, if it's very lucky, finally, eventually released from the circle of life. So not only is it wrong, according to general principles of ahimsa, to cause harm to animals, it's also wrong to kill them, even if you can do so without causing them suffering. But there's a different question, whether in killing a cow, one interferes with the ascent of the soul associated with it through many lives to the possibility of moksha or release from samsara, the cycle of birth and rebirth. If there is no such karmic harm when one kills an animal, then the person harmed by the killing is the killer. The killing of the cow is the killer. And in that case, in the painless killing of an animal, one harms only oneself. That being so, the question whether one ought to punish someone who painlessly kills an animal could be answered in the negative. They've already punished themselves, and that seems to have been Gandhi's view. The laws of karma will guarantee a negative cost to the wrongdoer without the state doing anything. While Muslims have no reason to think that killing cows is wrong in itself, there is a clear Islamic basis for a concern for animal welfare. There's a hadith which says, I'm just reading a translation from the web, verily Allah has enjoined perfection in all things, so when you kill, kill with perfection, and when you slaughter, slaughter with perfection. Let one of you sharpen his blade and spare the animal he slaughters from suffering. Right? So the basis for how Muslims think about the proper preparation of animals for eating involves killing them in a way that minimizes suffering. That's a remark made by the Prophet. So it seems to me that on the creedal grounds there is the possibility of an agreement with Hindus that cruelty to animals is wrong, but that the painless slaughter of beef cattle might be permitted to Indian Muslims. Settling that, though, involves, as I've said, complex and probably disputed questions about karma. So if this is a dispute that's genuinely rooted in creed, I believe there's a basis for a conversation about it, which will involve, as creedal discussions do, often complicated philosophical questions about things like the karmic significance to the soul associated with a cow of its being killed before its time. Okay, this is a very preliminary and primitive discussion of the doctrinal or creedal questions behind the struggle going on in India between Hindus and non-Hindus over the treatment of cattle. But if we turn from creedal questions to matters of practice, there is nothing at all to stop all parties agreeing that they will follow their different practices, with Muslims and some Dalits eating beef, and other, perhaps many Hindus refusing to do so. And on the identity front, there has never been any reason for Indian Hindus to be hostile to Muslims on grounds of identity, because the Sanskritic traditions of India, South Asia, have a long tradition of accepting a great diversity of religious identities. Indeed, much of the past, many in the past, would have thought that it was a matter for people, or perhaps communities, to find their way to a practice that made sense to them, drawing on the vast range of ritual and the many gods. You will remember that when you ask Hindus how many gods there are, conventional answer is 33 crore, C-R-O-R-E, that's 330 million. Plenty of scope for choice. Furthermore, the general practice of ahimsa suggests that even if you think that the way another person practices is wrong, violence against them is the wrong solution. Okay, I have pursued this discussion as one in which the resolution of the creedal level of such disputes depends on all the parties seeking to understand the other's creedal commitments and finding an agreement where possible that is consistent with all or as many as possible of them. So this requires a background of a kind of goodwill that is hard to find these days, not just in India. If one is already hostile to people of another identity, it will be tempting to insist on creedal interpretations that precisely because they reduce, to the extent that they reduce the possibility of compromise. But the creed-based resolution here depends upon taking a pluralist view about religious identities, a view according to which each community, and perhaps in the end each person, must be allowed to find their own way in matters of religious identity. This is, in my view, the core of the cosmopolitan attitude, and it is not hard to find evidence of that kind of pluralism in Hindu practice over the millennia. Notice, though, this is not the same thing as relativism. I can think my way is correct and still think that you should be allowed to live by your way, even though it is incorrect. As the Quran says in the Surah Al-Baqarah, "Let there be no compulsion in religion, for the truth stands out clearly from falsehood, so whoever renounces false gods and believes in Allah has certainly grasped the firmest unfailing handhold. So this passage affirms the truth of Islam while still refusing to compel other people to it. It's pluralist in that sense. So it's not relativist, but it is pluralist. So I've just spent a few minutes on an issue that would require many conversations among thoughtful Hindus and Muslims and others in India to come to a satisfactory resolution. My aim has been to suggest just that the distinction among creed, practice, and identity can be helpful in reflecting on conflicts that are grounded in religion like this. And I encourage you to see if this works with the many other examples of religious conflict that we see around us today. Thank you very much.